Hello, everyone, and welcome back for another episode of The Bright Side of Life. I am your host, Melissa Bright, and today we have a very, very special guest joining us. Her name is Amy Green Smith, and we are going to have an awesome episode that empowers all of the chronic people pleasers and perfectionists and really help them find their voice and speak up without being dicks, as Amy puts it. Amy is a certified and credentialed life coach, hypnotherapist, communication expert, speaker, and writer. And through her roles as a coach, writer, podcaster, and a speaker, she is on a mission to help people break free from the chains of silence and discover the power of their own voice. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be tackling perfectionism, people pleasing, and really how we can find our voice and speak up so we don't have to feel like these small little people anymore. So without further ado, Amy, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm so great, Melissa. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Me too. So I always start at the same place I basically do with all of my guests. I want to get your background or your backstory into what made you start down the personal development path in the first place. We all kind of have our own stories, so I'm really excited to hear how you arrived at yours.
Sure. So I guess this would sort of the genesis of my path into personal development was really intense, probably around like 05, 06, 07. I had started going to coaching school. I was really interested in what was happening with this inner voice in my head, and oh, you can actually do something about that. Oh my gosh, wow. So, so for a bit of background and context, I grew up in a very conservative, evangelical Christian home, and my father had a master's in divinity and a doctorate in ministry, so he wasn't fucking around.
Nope.
So of course, I went to very evangelical schools all growing up, all through junior high and high school, and for all intents and purposes, I was the quote good kid of the three, myself and my two younger siblings. And that kind of comes into play a little bit later. So in 07, my father passed away, and I felt very, very strongly that because I had a background in makeup artistry, I felt very convicted that I wanted to do his makeup for the viewing. And yeah, so like dead dad makeup and time of the show. And then I also spoke to crowds of like hundreds of people who were there. And so I felt like I was winning at daughter, right? That day. And we get back home to my mom's house, and she finds it the most opportune time to tell me that she feels that my father and her had failed as parents because the three of us, myself and my two younger brothers, were not, quote, walking with the Lord. We weren't, subscribing to the faith traditions that we had been raised with. So, of course, being grouped in with my two younger siblings who, had trouble with the law, both did jail time, didn't go to school, weren't really working. And I had been working since I was 14. I put myself through college. I, got married and moved out of the house really young. So I felt like to group me in and say, like, nothing matters to us except if you are on board with the faith that we raised you with, it doesn't matter. Nothing really else matters. And so in that moment, really the only thing that I could kind of muster was to say, you probably shouldn't say that to a child. And she said, well, that's just how I feel. And I'll tell you what, Melissa, that was the beginning when I realized, okay, there are situations where being authentic, honoring myself is going to mean that there's pain incurred on behalf of other people. And it's not often. In fact, I don't think it's often a ultimatum when we speak up for ourselves or when we deliver a boundary or have a tough conversation. But if it does come down to that and push comes to shove, and I have to decide between making someone else happy and making me happy, I'm going to choose me. And that was really the first time that I had truly been who I was. Because up until that point,
Mhm.
my husband, when we would go visit my parents, I would say, like, okay, no cussing, no drinking, no talking about Howard Stern, no talking about South Park, no liberal agenda. Like, and I really
Mhm.
twisted and contorted and kind of had this veneer of, I just didn't want to rock the boat in that way. And I didn't want to deal with that hurt of being a disappointment. In fact, I had
Mhm.
a friend of mine who grew up in the same kind of Christian organization that I did. And she was like, how on earth did you make peace with this, with your parents? And I said, I had to be comfortable being a disappointment to them because I wasn't a disappointment to myself,
Mhm.
and allowing that to be theirs to carry and not mine to carry. And that really was the beginning, sort of the impetus behind the work that I do now, which is kind of twofold. It's the internal lens of genuinely believing in your own worthiness, your own enoughness. I know you've talked
Yep.
about that a lot and worked on that a lot. So
Mhm.
your self-worth, essentially. And then the external component of, okay, now how do I then communicate that with the outside world? What
Mm.
do what does it sound like to ask an adult child to move out of the house? What are the words to use to ask for a divorce or to tell your family that you don't believe in the religion you were raised in? And I realized, oh, wow, you can actually be vocal about really polarizing topics and do so with grace and kindness. You don't have to be vitriolic and combative. And I'll tell you what, though, I right after that incident, I went through a phase where I was incredibly adversarial. It was like
Mhm.
the dam had burst, and I wanted to talk about everything we had never talked about. I'm like, let's talk about gay rights. Let's talk about abortion. And I was like really,
Yeah.
really combative. And it wasn't until many years later that I realized, oh, you can actually have those conversations and do so with grace and kindness, which has become, sort of a major pillar of the work I do now. But
Mhm.
that was sort of the origin story.
Okay. I love that. Unfortunately, I was on your website today because I try not to like really know people's stories like that much. So I got on the about page
Yeah, yeah,
and then I started reading and I'm like, shit, I don't want to read all this. I'm gonna like go to the next page because I knew I was gonna ask you about it.
yeah,
But I hey, there is not a better place to start personal development than literally one of those hard topics about
yeah,
religion and faith and what have you. So
yeah.
it's awesome. I mean, I think it's well, as you always say, like it's a very, very courageous thing to do.
Mhm.
Um, I want to ask you because
Yeah.
you said for years, I can tell. Is there a delay?
No.
Oh no, okay. For years, you said you were combative. Have
Mm.
you figured out why you think you were combative? Because when you said that,
Mhm.
I'm like, was she angry, like
Mhm.
at yourself or something? Like you were so quiet for so long, or what
Yeah.
was your reason for being combative?
That's a great question. Uh, well, I really feel like there was so much anger, and
Mm,
if you follow any of the work of Brené Brown, she talks about, she has a theory
mhm.
around the emotion of anger, that it is a secondary emotion, meaning that there's almost always a primary emotion that's underneath that. So
Yeah.
anger is one of our most easily accessible emotions because it's rooted in our fight response.
Yep.
So we're naturally going to defend against threat. But I think there are things now that as I've really unpacked it, and I'm working with a religious trauma therapist who specializes in religious abuse, and the more that I've learned about that, the more I've realized that anger is a completely warranted response to abuse. And there was so much that happened that was such uh, a deliberate shutting down of my independence, of who I was, of being motivated through guilt and fear,
Yep.
of telling children that they're responsible for the soul of others. Like there are just so many things, not to mention that the way that women are portrayed in the Bible is just absolutely abhorrent.
Mhm.
And so so now when I look back at it, it was that the floodgates had opened, and I did have so much anger because I felt robbed in a lot of ways. Like there
Right.
were so many things that I didn't experience because of the way that I was taught. And I saw now, I think when my dad had passed on, now it was just me against her. It didn't feel
Mm,
like it was two people that I could be up against. And what's really interesting about all of this is there was still an extreme amount of love. And this is what can be really difficult for people who are in abusive relationships, or who are involved in some sort of like cultish mentality.
mhm.
Um, there are also good times, right? It's not like it was laden with abuse. In fact,
Right.
a lot of it I didn't even see till 20, 30 years later.
Right.
So, um, that's one thing that I would really want to stress, is that if you have a lot of anger, that's a completely warranted response to abuse or to trauma. In fact, it's part of our grief process. So, but that is another one of the pieces of the narrative, especially if you're a part of a marginalized community and you're loud and you yell and you're angry, you get tone policed real fucking fast.
Mhm.
And so I think it's twofold. I think it's one, we have to learn how to communicate so that we can just get our needs met. But I also think it's important to understand that being angry in those situations is completely normal, and we're still responsible for how we choose to behave. So there were many times when I had to apologize to my mom for my delivery, not necessarily the content of what I was saying, but how I said it. So I would go back to her and say, hey, listen, I still feel very strongly about the things we conversed about, but I should not have said it in that manner. You did
Mhm.
not deserve to be spoken to in that way. But don't take back your content. Don't take back your stance, because that is one of the things that we do. We have sort of this
Yes.
speaking up
Yep.
hangover, and
Yep.
then we go, holy shit, they're not happy with me. Let me acquiesce and people please and do whatever I can to make them see me a specific way,
Yep.
instead of going, no, here's the part that I need to clean up. And that was my delivery, not necessarily my stance.
Mm.
Yeah.
I heard you say that on one of your episodes yesterday, and I'm like just yelling at the top of my lungs, like, yes, exactly that. Exactly that.
Yeah.
Because I too was the angry person. And every time I was told, like, don't talk to me that way, I totally knew it was not okay or right.
Mhm.
But I still felt very strongly about what I
Yes.
was trying to get across or
Yeah.
say. And so I love that you do teach about both of those components, about like we can still say things and not be an asshole or a dick
Yeah.
or all of those things.
Yeah.
Um I want to kind of get into talking about people pleasing and perfectionism,
Sure.
um because I know that we probably have many people on here that are like, I might be a people pleaser or a perfectionist. And more importantly, I eventually want to go back to your relationship with your mom, because I feel
Mhm.
like when we address people pleasing,
Mm.
it's really scary because you're like, what is going to happen with this relationship? Like, I
Yeah.
can't speak up because I might lose this person, so on and so forth. Um, so why don't
Yeah.
we start at the basics of what is people pleasing?
Well, oh my gosh, I love this question, because I find that so many people think of a people pleaser in a very specific context.
Mhm.
Usually it conjures an image of someone who's very meek and mild and very soft spoken, and maybe even their posture is a little bit, you know,
Yep.
repressed. And so you don't think about people being people pleasers who are, you know, high powered entrepreneurs and, badass women in the work world. It's, but if I were to ask you, are you highly invested in the opinions of other people, so much so that you twist and contort your behavior,
Mm.
then you're probably people pleasing. But here's the other thing that we need to know about it. It's not always a bad thing. And there are a lot of concepts that get tossed around in the personal development sphere that I think we think of them like absolutes, like people pleasing is always something that we need to stop. And that's not the case. Same thing with perfectionism. If I go in for neurosurgery, like I sure as fuck hope that person is a perfectionist
Yeah.
working on my brain.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So I think there are times when that really serves us. Now, people pleasing is rooted in our primitive defense mechanisms. It's an
Mm.
iteration of our fawn response. If you're familiar at all, or those listening, with the fight, flight, freeze fawn, fawn is a little bit of a newer one. If we're looking at it through a primitive lens, it would be, let's say you're being attacked by a mountain lion. To fawn as a fear response or as a defense would be to say, here's some meat, here, kitty, kitty, go over there, go that way, right? Like, so you're trying to kind of befriend or placate an aggressor or a threat.
Mm.
Well, now we're not necessarily running from mountain lions, but we do worry about what our in-laws think of us, or if someone's going to hire us or not. And that is the same thing, where we are viewing something as a threat. And so we are sending in a defense mechanism to get through. And for most of us, we had to adopt something like that as children in order to stay safe. So let's say you had a really volatile parent or an alcoholic caregiver or an abuser, and you learned like walking on eggshells or tiptoeing or always making sure that they're taken care of. You could fly under the radar.
Yep.
Or maybe you had a sibling that needed a lot of attention. And so you realized the only way you could find your worth or even be noticed was through being flawless and perfect. Maybe then I'll be lovable. So a lot of times we develop these behavioral tactics genuinely to stay safe, but then we get later on in life in our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and we go, holy shit, that's not helpful. That's enabled me to have 3 abusive marriages, or, a
Yep.
workplace that I hate, or I'm tolerating something from a business partner or from children. So I think we have to, first of all, recognize we're wired for belonging.
Mhm.
We are, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of our primitive human needs is for love and belonging.
Yep.
And that again comes from our primitive ancestors who there was no tribe of one. Like you had to belong to a group, to an organization of people in order to survive.
Yep.
So that same thing is happening for us now, where we go, if these people don't approve of me, I might not survive it. And we don't
Mm.
consciously think that, but that's what's happening on the subconscious part of our mind that's running a majority of our behavior. So I think it's important for us to just understand, when we're talking about a concept like people pleasing, there is a lot of nuance there. It's not that we have to knock it off all the time.
Right.
Um, One of the examples I use all the time is I identify as queer, and we've got our rainbow flag out and all of that stuff. And so if I am in the middle of a situation where I'm clearly around folks who are not supportive of the queer community,
Mhm.
and my physical safety could be threatened, I might need to people please to just live, to
Mm.
just survive. And
Yep.
that permeates all different marginalized identities, where you sometimes have to do that in order to stay safe.
Yep.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we
Yep.
have to remember that there's nuance and discernment here. And what I'm talking about most of the time is when we're involved in situations where we're very clear that we're getting in our own way, that
Yes.
we're so worried about what someone else thinks about us, that we actually change our own behavior, or we sacrifice something of value to ourselves.
Yep.
So,
I
yeah.
love that. You literally gave like the whole scope of people pleasing, because I was basically going to go through like all the who, what, when, where's, why's, all that stuff
Yeah.
to address it. And I love that you are also saying that it's not just this one little box of people pleasers, of just like this tiny, shy, scared little
Mhm.
person that's just like, because I am super outgoing, extrovert,
Yeah.
but I had a lot of people pleasing tendencies
Mhm.
from my dad, who was a 6'6", 300-pound, very scary man that I never
Wow.
backtalked ever.
Sure.
So people pleasing, the walking on eggshells, stay under the radar, just don't go to him for anything if there's any,
Yeah.
that's what I grew up with, and that's until 2020. And then I started realizing, like, oh, I am really sacrificing so much of myself
Hmm.
for other people.
Right.
Even so much as like opinions, like shit
Hmm.
I don't even agree with, or just
Yeah.
saying yes because, not that I always want to like start that conversation and get in a argument
Yeah.
battle about
That's
whose
right.
opinion's right, but just being able to have one, because I know you also said that on one of your episodes too, of like just having an opinion.
Yeah.
So I love that you said that. Now, what are some like practical tips? And if we want to give a scenario, we can do that, of like, how can we stop people pleasing today?
Yeah.
If and if you want to throw in a scenario, an example.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that we can do specifically to figure this out. First of all, we have to look at where is people pleasing an actual issue.
Mm,
Um, so one of the best ways to do that is that's a little hack, and it is to take an inventory of the people you complain about that you don't actually have a conversation with. So most of the time we're speaking up, but we're telling the wrong people. So you're pissed at your partner and your best friend gets an earful, or you're furious at your mom and your therapist hears about it every week. But so I'm not talking about just needing to vent or release, the trauma of the day. What I'm
mhm,
talking about is habitually complaining about one particular person, but not being willing to have a conversation with them. And they are the only ones who can remedy your grievance. They are the
mm.
only ones. So if it's worth complaining about, it's probably worth taking action on. Otherwise, you've just locked yourself into victimhood. So that's the first item of business is there anyone I'm chronically complaining about, but they would have no idea? Or they would have no idea I felt this extreme about it. Maybe you've given a little indication that you're not happy, but you haven't said what a deal breaker it is for you.
Mm,
Years ago, I had a friend of mine who did speak up many times to her partner, to her husband, and they did therapy, she did therapy, they did, a bunch of different things, and she spoke up. But the one thing she didn't do was emphasize the depth of the importance, that the things that she was upset about were deal breakers. So to say something like, I don't see myself continuing to work at this place for another year if we don't rectify this division of labor,
mhm.
or in a marriage saying like, this is deal breaker status for me. Like, I don't see us making it long term. I don't know if I have another year in me. I don't know if I have another 6 months in me. We have to change, right? So where
Yep.
you're creating the emphasis of, not only do I feel this way, but I feel this strongly about it. That's another huge piece of
Okay.
it. So we're finding out, okay, here are the places where I tend to not speak up, right? And I'm making someone else's wants, needs, and opinions a little bit more important than mine.
Mhm.
So then it starts to showcase, here's the place, here's the opportunity. Then I want you to ask yourself this question, because fear will show up when we are onto something, when you're just about to launch a coaching business, or go back to school, or write a book, or whatever. If it's new, if you've never done it before, fear will kick in. And because it's our brain registers things that are known or unknown, and things that are known are safe, things that are unknown are not safe. So if we don't know how to be confident, how to speak up for ourselves, how to love ourselves, trying to do that registers in the brain as unsafe. So one of the things that we have to ask ourselves every time there's fear is this situation, am I actually in danger? Or is this just new? So after you've done your inventory and you've realized, holy shit, I'm complaining about this coworker all the time, but they have no idea how pissed I am about this. And then you ask yourself, like, okay, I'm having a lot of fear about speaking up. Is it just new, or am I actually in danger? And so you have to discern right there, because sometimes it's not worth speaking up because you are actually in danger, right?
Right.
Like advice that I give to people who are in actual abusive relationships are very different than the communication
Right.
tools that I give people who aren't.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly important, because there are a lot of women out there who are doing the work, and they're listening to podcasts, and they're hiring the therapist, and then they think it's got to be some sort of communication tool I can learn to magically make my partnership different, or to and that's what we do not need, is more women thinking, oh, if only I can figure it out, if only I can make this person change. And we just can't do that.
Nope.
So I think it's an important thing to underline.
Mm.
So I think those checks and balances at the very beginning, you can at least see, where do I need to start giving voice? And then, am I actually liberated enough to do so? Am I actually not in danger?
Yeah.
And then it becomes about the difficult process of speaking up or creating a boundary. And one thing that I use all the time that could be a great phrase for everyone listening is, do not allow your silence to make you a liar.
Oh.
Do not allow your silence to make you a liar. So I had a situation many, many years ago. I used to do community theater. And there was a gentleman who I was in a show with, and he came up to me and he was showing me, like, oh, haha, this is such a funny meme on my phone. And he's showing me this meme, and it was supposed to be funny, which I did not think it was at all, but it was a completely disparaging meme about a mentally and physically disabled child, which to me is like, that's not comedy.
No.
That's pretty gross.
Right.
So he shows this to me, and like the easy thing to do would have been like, ha ha, ha, and just like walked away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I knew I did not want my silence to make me complicit with what he thought was funny. So if I'm not speaking up, I look like I agree.
Yep.
And I'm
Yep.
not going to do that. I mean, that's my integrity. But here's the other thing. I also don't want to get into a full-blown conversation with him. So here's what it sounded like. So I said, hey, I do not find that funny at all. And I would appreciate it if you just didn't show me anything like that in the future. Cool. All right. So I'll see you on the stage. Are you running that scene? Like, just change the subject.
Yeah.
But I was very clear, I don't share that opinion. And we can do that all the time. So I like to have these like stock one-liners that I can have to communicate. But with things that offend you, if you're around family and they have different views that you do, which is like all of us, to say something like, you know what, I don't share that opinion. I respect that that's yours, but I certainly don't agree. Or I actually find that really offensive, but I don't think this is the place for us to discuss it. You, just because you speak up does not mean you have to entertain an entire conversation. You can speak up and have a boundary at that exact time of, I don't agree with you, and I'm also not willing to talk about it right now. You know what I mean? And so I think we don't realize that we don't have to give a fucking TED talk about why we feel that way. We don't. We can
Right.
shut that shit down right away.
I
Yeah.
I want to add something to that, because you don't have to go on to explain yourself, because when you go to do that thing and you stand up for yourself, or you just say how you feel, this person could very, very likely get defensive and offended,
Uh-huh.
because now they feel like a jackass that they just said
Yes.
that, but they're not going to say, potentially,
Yes.
they could apologize, but more than likely not, they're going to get offended and make it your fault, and oh, you're just too sensitive or whatever. And you don't need to keep trying to convince them of that.
That's
Of
right.
You don't have to keep convincing them. And that's exactly why she's saying you can shut the conversation down right there and don't need to entertain it, because more than likely they're not going to see it your way, and you
Yeah.
don't need to try to convince them otherwise.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Because everyone believes that they are right.
Yep.
Literally everyone. So it
Yes.
does not matter if how sound of the logic and reason you think you have. It does not matter. So, and that does happen. I'm really glad you brought that up, because most of the time when people are called out in some way like that, no matter how gentle it is, they are embarrassed and there's a fragile
Yep.
ego and they want to
Yep.
say, you're so sensitive, or it's just a joke. And you can, and so my favorite thing to do that is to say something like, I don't really think that that constitutes joking. I don't think that's a joking matter. Or I really don't appreciate you dismissing my feelings simply because you don't agree.
Yeah.
Or wow, who's the snowflake now?
Yes.
No, I don't typically suggest
Right.
things that are going to be inciting, because here's the other thing. What we were talking about at the very beginning, of course it's natural that you want to be defensive and that you want to be angry and frustrated with people. But the more dramatic and loud you are, the easier you are to dismiss. If you've been drinking, it's easier for people to dismiss you. Oh, you're just being crazy. You just,
Yep.
oh, you had too much to drink.
Yep.
And it sucks. It's wildly unfair. And it is, I love to see when I see lots of, middle-aged white men losing their shit. I'm always like, God, men are so emotional. Jeez. God, because they're constantly losing their shit.
Yeah.
But so I think it sucks that we have to be toned policed, but I think it is our best bet at not being dismissed.
Yeah.
So is it fair? No. Is it effective? Fuck yes. So if
Yep.
you can be completely calm and like, well, it sounds like that's a really touchy subject for you as well. So I think it's probably best if we don't discuss this.
Yep.
And they're becoming unhinged because they can't, like, who looks more, of sound mind? So
Yep.
I think about that, like, what's the least likely presentation that I need to give in order to not be dismissed, like least likely to be dismissed. Because that's what we all want. We're all working towards being heard, being seen, or being understood. That's what we all want, right?
Yes.
So we need to try at least to show up in a way where we can set ourselves up for success.
Okay, so here's another question for that, which it might be down the similar line of that. What if you know that when you speak up for yourself, that this person's going to get defensive anyways, that you have just you just know, no matter how nicely you
Mhm.
say it. So say for that person, like you weren't really sure how they're going to react. You just work with him this, but
Yeah.
you've had many interactions with a person that you're like, I really need to speak up for myself, but I know they're going to get defensive. What do you suggest somebody do in that regard? Because it
Mhm.
is on their heart to speak up about whatever the situation is. Like, I must say this because I need to either say it, I need to set a boundary, but
Yeah.
this person's going to get defensive. What do we do?
Well, first of all, somebody being defensive is not the end of the world. It's not our ideal. Ideally, we would love for somebody to be super receptive and be like, okay, cool. I can't wait to work on that. That's what we really want. Um, we don't get that very often, but here's what I'll say is we cannot overstep how big of a deal it is how you say this,
Mm.
because this is the one area that I see people ignore over and over and over again because they feel so validated and vindicated by talking about how awful the other person is, right? So
Mhm.
they're like, they deserved it. Like, they just make me so angry. I had to. So you have to really check in and ask yourself, how would I respond if I was on the receiving end of me?
Yep. Yep.
If I was on the receiving end of me, would I feel disarmed? Would I feel like someone genuinely wants to hear my thoughts? Would I feel like genuinely concerned and wanting to work on that for the other person? Or the way that you are speaking to me, would I want to fight, flee, freeze, or fawn, right? Because
Mm.
if you feel like you are being attacked, if you feel like you're having some sort of threat, you will respond typically through those means.
Yep.
So we even know that like 7% of what we say, like the actual phrase, literal words that we say, have about it has an impact of about 7% compared to 93% is conveyed through our body language and our tone of voice. Now that
Okay.
doesn't mean that what people only hear 7% of what you say. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
I'm talking about your paraverbal and your nonverbal skills speak louder than your literal words. So,
Okay.
no matter how clear you think you've been, if you have not said that calmly, vulnerably, softly, with a gentle request, it's likely that you might be inciting them into their fear responses. Like they
Yeah.
are getting into their defensiveness, right?
Right.
Most people, if you softly address them, and this is where vulnerability as a skill comes in, will match that. We have mirror neurons in the brain. We will naturally mimic the emotions that we see from other people. So for example, let's say you're driving and you accidentally cut somebody off,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you're like, oh shit, oh my gosh, oh, I'm so sorry. And they're like, fuck you, and like honking
Right.
and blah, blah, blah. What is your response? You don't ever go, you know what? You're right. I could really work on that. And I'm going to drive a little bit safer. And here's what I'm going to do differently next time. No, you go into your fight, you get
Yep.
just as combative, or
Yep.
you go, oh my God, so sorry. And you flee, you run, I'm going to
Yep.
drive away.
Yep.
So we cannot overstep this because most people, when I say, have you said something? They're like, yeah, I've said things a ton of times. I'm like, how have you said it? Right? Because could you hear you? Ask yourself, could I hear me? And then it becomes about a couple of things. One is conversation consent. That's one way you can set yourself up for less defense. Because when
Mm.
people are caught off guard
Yeah.
and you say things that are abrupt, like we need to talk, or we need to have a discussion, or we need a meeting, that immediately puts somebody on the defense already.
Yeah.
So if you can say something like, I've got a couple things I'd like to run by you. I would like to get your opinion on a few things. Some things have been on my mind. I'd love to toss around with you. That sort of lighter language, and then saying, "What does your schedule look like? When would this work for both of us?"
Yeah.
If you've ever been caught off guard, I mean, it's just like, "Wait, what? What are you mad
Yeah.
about? What?"
Yeah.
You immediately go into defense. So that's one thing you can do is like get the conversational consent. And then if they say what it's regarding, tell them what it's regarding because that's the worst too, especially
Yeah.
if you're anxious and then you just ruminate on it for 2 days and you're like, "Fuck, what do they wanna talk about?"
Yep.
So, if you can get that consent and then say, "Oh, yeah, it's related to that, the project that we were working on and some ideas that I had,"
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they at least know what's up. Or I didn't feel fully settled about, like, sort of the division of labor with that project, and I would love to get your opinion on it. That is
Yeah.
so much more, like,
Yeah.
disarming, right?
Yep.
Then again, back to those mirror neurons, if you show up vulnerably, you are so much more likely to elicit vulnerability from them. So, what that would sound like is something like this. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. Like, I just realized that there are a handful of things that my mind's been running away with it, and I've been getting really resentful. And it dawned on me that you probably would have no idea because I haven't said anything to you, and that is wildly unfair to you. Um, so I would love to talk to you about fill in the blank and see if there's a way that we can both feel honored around this. Because I don't feel like I've been entirely fair to you. So what you're cleaning up, what you're owning in that moment is
Mm-hmm.
just the fact that you haven't talked about it yet.
Yep.
You're not owning that you've done something wrong or that think that your stance isn't valid or anything like that. You're just saying, hey, my vulnerable entry point here is to tell you I haven't been totally honest, and that's not fair to this relationship. So those sorts of tactics at the front end of the conversation can change everything. And I'll tell you, I've had a couple of situations with my mom where I went in really vulnerably. In
Mhm.
fact, she would do things a lot where she would act very entitled and like, well, I'm the mom and you're supposed to want to hang out with me and you're supposed to want to do all these things. And I was like, guess who didn't ask to be born? Um,
Oh my God, my daughter says that shit all the time.
guess who didn't ask? And so I went to her and I just said, hey, listen, because here's the other thing that we need to know is most of the time when people are hypercritical, it's because of a need that they're not getting met and they don't know how to say it any other way than to be critical. Right? So if your partner thinks
Right.
that you
Yes.
work too much and it's easier for them to criticize you saying you work too much, that's easier to say than I don't
I
feel like I matter to you as much in this relationship, and that's really painful and hard for me to live into every day. So we usually take the surface route, right? We talk about the thing that we can be righteous about. So with her, I had to genuinely go to her and say, listen, my assumption, again, this is assuming positive intent. And my assumption is that you genuinely want to spend time with me and that you want a connection. But I want to be really clear with you that these sorts of statements tend to repel me a lot because um, it feels entitled, it feels victimy, and it makes it really difficult for me to want to be there for you, which I'm guessing is the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. So
Mm.
we had like a really great conversation about it and she was really open. Another thing that I did just now is I refrained from using the word you.
Yep.
So instead of going, well, you do this and you do that, which immediately puts people on the defense, is if you can say, it seems as though there have been instances where, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or I'm wondering if this has been influenced by work related stress instead of, are you stressed out from work? And that's why you keep taking shit out on me.
Right.
Right. Like, so if you can eliminate that word, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it can be helpful in softening that defense too.
Yeah. Spot on. I'm loving all these examples. These are super helpful.
Good.
In some of my situations, I just want to put it out there because I've been in a situation where I'm like, I'm ready. I'm going to speak my truth. I'm going to state whatever.
Yeah.
Just because the other person it's not well received, or just because the other person doesn't get vulnerable back, because that's not always going to happen. In my case,
Yes.
it never happened, maybe
Yep.
2% of the time. Every other time it was defense. um I just want to say, don't give up. Like, where I always went when I would try to speak up and then it didn't go the way that I wanted it to go,
Mhm.
well, then I just go back in my shell even more. Well, why the fuck do I even say anything? Because it's just never going to go anywhere. It's not true, but I also feel like you can't have expectations of how the other person's going to react, because I was always like, if I say it small or if I say it very nice in this tone, this person will say exactly the words that I know they're going to say. And that
Mhm.
almost never happened. And so I don't, what I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
don't give up on that. Like, you're going to have a lot of different responses.
Yes.
Some, just because you're vulnerable, they're not going to be vulnerable back. They could still be offended, get defensive, but don't give up, but still maybe look at how you said it. Um, I love that we're really diving deeper into this about all these
Yeah.
different things, because I was the one that would give up, to be like, why even try? They didn't do it the way that I thought it was gonna.
Yes. Yes, yes. I'm so, so glad that you brought this up because there's a lot of things in personal development like that. Like, just learn how to establish boundaries and you're like, you'll be shit and glitter and it'll be fantastic. And it's really not how it goes.
Mm-mm.
So here's the big distinction that I think is important in what you just said. You're still looking for your fulfillment from the other person. You're
Mhm.
still looking at the situation going, I can be happy if they see it my way, if they understand me, if they rise to the occasion, but we cannot control any of that. So our goal in these conversations has to be about our own self-worth, not about how we are received. Because
Mm.
when I talk to people about learning how to establish boundaries, tough conversations, saying no, I'm not doing it for some arbitrary personal development exercise.
Mm-hmm.
I am doing it because every single time you silence yourself, you send a subconscious message to your own mind that that person's wants, needs, and opinions are more important than my own. And when we have that over and over and over again by staying silent, no wonder we think we're not enough. We're making everyone else more important than ourselves.
Yep.
So that then filters into, well, I don't want to get this business off the ground, or I feel like an imposter in my career, or I'm scared to get back into the dating scene, because we think we're not enough. So when I'm talking to you about having these conversations about boundarying up or delivering things to people that you're genuinely scared about, I'm not doing it for the fuck of it. I'm doing it because it literally, your self-worth depends on it.
I love that.
So, and what you're talking about too is the goal has to be, I'm speaking up for Melissa. I'm giving voice to this because it's important for Amy, not because I have to get a specific result. Do I have an ideal? Absolutely. And will I be disappointed if I don't get it? Absolutely. But that's why I think a lot of this will have collateral damage, right? Like sometimes there are casualties to our self-worth
Yeah.
because there are people who prefer the people-pleasing version of us. They like the doormat version of us. And once we start taking a stand for ourselves, you'll learn very quickly who's on your team and who's not. So instead of leaving that scenario and going, see, why do I speak up? I should never do it. The conclusion, the alternate conclusion could be like, wow, they really showed me who they were. And if they aren't capable of seeing the boundaries that I need, that tells me a lot about that person's role in my life, not if I made a bad choice or not. So, what you will most often experience is what I call dichotomous emotion, where you are going to, on one hand, feel super proud of yourself for speaking up, and then maybe also totally disappointed or super
Yes.
sad or
Yep.
overwhelmed or let down or embarrassed. So you're probably going to have two very opposing emotions. But what you have to remember is the other person's response tells them a lot more about who they are, tells you a lot more about who they are versus if you made a mistake, if I said it wrong, if I shouldn't have done that. It's like, well, no, if I'm
Mhm.
presenting this in a safe way and they're showing up clearly not able to carry that, that's very indicative about if this person needs to be this big of a role in my life or not.
Yep. Mm.
Yeah.
We could talk about this subject all day long, all day
Yes,
long.
I
Well, that
definitely could.
yeah, for sure, and give many, many examples. But why don't we switch it over to perfectionism? Can we talk a
Sure.
little bit about perfectionism? Now, I want to ask you, are perfectionism and people pleasing, are they related? Are they
Mhm.
in the same group? If so, how and why are they kind of in the same
Yeah,
little realm or group?
I would put all of that is basically semantics and
Okay.
depends on who you talk to. I think really what it comes down to is recognizing specific behavioral patterns that we employ that are getting in the way of something that we want.
Mm.
So a lot of times perfectionism is getting in the way of taking action. Like a lot of times we're like, I just need to be perfect. I need to have the perfect website. I need to have the perfect amount of credentials. I need to do all these things before I launch, right?
Yep.
Sometimes it is, I need to have these specific people like me and view me as perfect in order to be valuable. We have all these different ways that we try to take care of ourselves. And I feel like perfectionism is under the category of people pleasing
Mm.
because perfectionism is, I need to be seen by people in a very specific way. It is, I need to have clout. I need to look a specific way, but that's not for you. That's for the world. That's for other people. That's for, so to me, it falls into the people pleasing category. But really, what it all is, whether we're talking about that, whether we're talking about control, procrastination, like a lot of these are just ways that we're trying to get our needs met. But we get to a place later on in life where we go, oh, this is infringing on my needs getting met. Like now it's virtually impossible for me to find a great person while I'm dating online because I just want to be what everyone else wants,
Mm,
that sort of a thing.
yeah.
So, but I think perfectionism is really uh it's another piece of my self-worth being outsourced,
Yep.
which is exactly what people pleasing is, right? It's I'm okay, I'm valuable as long as you think I'm okay. I mean, it kind of falls into the same category for me.
I love that you said outsourced.
Mhm.
That's such like a different way that I've heard it before. Huh. So I'm going to say that I am a recovering perfectionist. This comes
Mhm.
from once again my dad being extremely hard on me and I had to be perfect. Like it it was when I was a little girl, he used to remind me if I would have like a little sip of my grandparents' coffee or something like that's gonna stunt your growth or anything about kind of like my image or like, oh, did you shower today, like, but I'm on a farm of 50 acres and we're gonna be in the dirt and stuff all day. It always seemed to be around like my how I looked. And
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
anyways, and when you have parents, it's education, like college, like you must go to college, you must do this, you must do this. And
Yeah.
so I am recovering perfectionist, but my dad was my number one that I tried to impress and I have totally disappointed him. I didn't finish college. I had my daughter at 16. He is now dead. So I'm like, okay, well, at least I have nothing left to prove, but I had to reconcile all that because I don't get to anymore. Um so, recovering perfectionist here. I'm not going to identify as a perfectionist because I have worked on that
Good.
also. Also.
Yeah, I mean, if there's something that you're trying to shed and you don't want to be that thing anymore, stop identifying that way, right?
Yeah.
Like stop saying I'm such a perfectionist because you keep cementing that into your mind.
Yeah.
And you know what I think is important here to talk about with your dad is so much of the time people are parenting through their own wounds.
Yes.
And my guess would be that he had a real shit time growing up. And a lot of times, what you'll do with your kids is you'll want them to not have the same struggles you have.
Yeah.
And so it'll come off really awful. Like there's a fat activist who I follow who talks a lot about fat liberation. And
Mm.
she was talking about how her mom was super, gave her tons of pressure around the food that she ate and around her body. But she was informed by our culture and like what happens when you're in a fat
Oh,
body in our culture and like what they do to you. And so her mom was like, well, maybe we can control your body because we can't control the culture.
mm,
So it's coming from a pure place,
right.
but it doesn't mean that harm is not incurred.
Yep.
And one thing that I think is important for us to know is sometimes when we say people are doing the best that they can, sometimes the best people can do is being a full-on abuser. And that doesn't mean that we accept that. It means that it falls to me under a category of understandable but not acceptable.
Oh,
Is it
yeah.
understandable maybe why your dad was the way he was? Sure. Is
Yep.
it acceptable? Fuck no.
Right.
But having allowing two things to coexist,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's out of that binary. So
Yeah.
instead of it being like dad was all bad or all good, most of us are a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
And we do shitty things sometimes and we cause harm. But I think again, it's having these real nuanced scenarios where we don't have to put a stamp on dad being all bad, or being all good. That's the other thing is we feel like if we acknowledge harm that was incurred from our parents that we're now somehow selling them out, or that
Mm,
the good times didn't matter, or that they didn't do anything good for us, right? And it's like,
yep.
no, I'm saying that all of these things coexisted.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so true because my brother, I have a lot more issues like I did. I don't anymore. I truly have forgiven my dad because I can hold both of those like compassion and see how like hard
Yes.
his dad was on him. So I get it. But when I talk to my brother about it, he almost like defends him because he lived with my dad mostly, and my dad was just as bad to my brother as he was me, if not worse. But I try to tell my brother, I'm like, Gary, I'm just having this conversation. Like, I have forgiven dad, but there are things that dad didn't do, and mom also, like, that were not okay, you know?
Mhm.
And so I think he thinks that I still hold this anger. So I always try to remind him, this is just conversation. I have forgiven dad, but he did or did not do this, and that was not okay.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Well, and I also think like Gary gets to have his own
Yep.
experience,
Yep.
right? Like what he experienced under your dad is very different than you.
Yeah.
And also, there's incredibly different experiences for little girls growing up versus little boys in our culture.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of other things at play here. And this is why I oftentimes will say, speak your truth into ears that can hear you. And he might not always be the ears that can hear you. And what I mean by that is not what I'm really talking about with speaking your truth into ears that can hear you is who you turn to share your deepest stuff with,
Mm,
your biggest wounds, or where you are the most fragile. Those are the people who need to have earned the right to hear your story, as Brene will say.
yeah.
Um, so with those sorts of situations, I think like you probably always want Gary to be open, and you want him to see it your way, and you want him to you we like the idea of them being a safe place to land, but sometimes they're not capable, and that's
Yeah.
when we have to go, okay, I don't know if this is always going to be the healthiest for me to share this with him, because here I am trying to coddle him, making sure he feels okay. So we're
Mm,
still making sure Gary's all right, which is another form of denying
mm.
your real lived experience, right? So
So true. Shit, you caught me. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
I do that. I do
Mhm.
that here and
That's
there.
okay. I'm here to learn and admit any faults that I have because I
Yeah.
just want to keep learning.
Yeah.
Now something whenever I took therapy and did therapy, I learned early on, like we addressed my first two things, anxiety and my perfectionism. And one thing that I was really surprised by, because I thought I was not a perfectionist, I thought to be a perfectionist, you had to want perfection in all areas of your life.
Mm-mm.
So, is that true? Do you have to be a perfectionist in all areas, or can it just be one that you're like really obsessed with?
Yeah, it can be just one, it can be a myriad of them. Like I have ways that perfectionism is manifested.
Mm.
And it's not for me in like my car, let's say. Like my
Yep.
car's a mess
Yep.
and I just don't give a shit.
Yep.
I just don't care. I've never cared about it. And but if but I can be up all night working on graphics for workbooks for my team or for my clients, right?
Yeah.
Like and I will nitpick the fuck out of graphics. So part of it is I have to recognize where does that show up for me?
Mhm.
And when is it in service of me and when is it not? Because I really think that perfectionism is it can be better stated or addressed, I think, if we honor a value that we have and don't try to deny the value, but call it something like a value around excellence, accuracy, and precision. Um, Sometimes it's around impact, philanthropy, achievement, accomplishment. We can have values around those things because those can actually exist.
Mhm.
Perfectionism does not exist. Like nothing is ever perfect. Like it just isn't. So it's
Mm-mm.
a way that we set the bar so unrealistically high that we are constantly feeling like a failure. So we constantly feel like a failure, then we feel like we're not enough, and then we don't do anything because we just become stagnant and we
Yep.
procrastinate. So I would encourage everybody out there, if you struggle with perfectionism, to say, okay, but what is the antithesis of that? What is the way that it actually shows up and is helpful? It's helpful for me to do things with excellence. It's
Yep.
helpful for me to value accuracy and precision. It's helpful for me to accomplish things in my life. And there's a very fine line of when a value contributes to your happiness and then when it crosses over into an obsession where now you have to do that thing in order to feel like you are valuable. Now we've
Mhm.
tethered it to our self-worth. So we've gone, instead of, I'm going to get this master's degree and I'm going to feel so incredible and so proud of myself and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Now we go, if I don't achieve that thing, I'm not enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not valuable. So now it's a value that's crossed over into something that's no longer fulfilling us. So that's the big place to look, is this value that I have around, I just use excellence most of the time because
Yeah.
that's another big fallacy, is people think like, if I let go of this perfectionism, I'm going to do shit jobs on everything. I'm not going to care about how I present myself. I'm not going to care about my work. And I'm just going to be a lazy piece of shit. No, we're just talking about changing that moniker so it's more empowering and it actually feels attainable. And then we can actually discern, when is this in service of me, when it's not. Another example I love to use is when I have a value around order and organization, right? Like I
Mhm.
love touching things and labels, and I love all my file folders to be organized. But if I have friends who are coming over
Mhm.
and I can't calm down and enjoy my time with them because I'm so concerned about getting the dishes washed, now that value around order and organization is thwarting my happiness. It's infringing
Mm.
on my ability to enjoy my time. It's stealing my joy. It's in control of me.
Yep.
So that's where we have to look at, like, okay, if I have this value around excellence, when does it serve me? And when is it stealing my joy? And that's when we can start altering our behavior.
Oh my gosh. I just love all your outlooks on all of this stuff. It's super super helpful. I haven't heard, maybe on my paper, I don't know what, how perfectionism is related to value. So that
Yeah.
was super helpful. I know you were wanting to keep it to an hour,
Yeah.
so we're kind of there right now. But are there any last messages that you would like to send, give my audience about, people pleasing, perfectionism, finding their own voice, what have you?
Yeah. I think one of my favorite phrases that I repeat to myself all the time is, I am responsible for my intention, not my reception. And what I mean by that is, you can only control who you are being, how you are showing up, how you're delivering information. That is the only thing that we can control. The reception is all across the board. Sometimes people will love what we have to say and they'll be supportive. Sometimes they'll be indifferent and apathetic and just don't give a shit. Sometimes they'll think that we're an awful, horrible human. But we cannot make sure that all of those people are happy. So the barometer of success has to be with ourselves. Have I conducted myself in a way in which I am proud? Yes or no? Is there anything that I would tweak or change? Is there anything I need to clean up? And then that becomes about you, not necessarily about how anyone else feels about you. You are responsible for your intention, not your reception.
That is a damn good quote. I
Thank you.
love it. I like picked up my pen as soon as I said that. So, or as soon as you said that. So thank you. Amy, if people want to work with you, do any of your programs, where can they find all your information at?
Absolutely. Come hang out. My corner of the internet is amygreensmith.com. And I always say that all three of those names are spelled the basic bitch way.
Love it.
Very easy, amygreensmith.com. And I have tons of freebies over there, free workbooks, some free hypnosis. And I hang out the most on Instagram, like any self-respecting Gen Xer. And so you can find me under the handle, Hey Amy Green Smith. and same handle pretty much on all of social media. But yeah, come hang out. There's lots of freebies on the site. And I have a back catalog of almost 500 episodes of podcasts. So yeah, come over and learn a thing or two.
Yes, go check out her podcast. I binged it literally for like 10 hours yesterday. So good, so good. And your energy is just super contagious. And I learned so much from all of that stuff. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more question that I ask all of my guests this. So, Amy, in your own words or definition, what does the bright side of life mean to you?
Oh, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is truly being anchored in your self-worth, in your value, in your enoughness. Because I think a majority of life, especially in our capitalist society, if you're here in the US, it's all about hustle and productivity and production and how much you can deliver and produce. And we don't look at who we are as already just being innately worthy without having to hustle for that worth or outsource that worth. So that has been the single most liberating thing I've ever done for myself, was genuinely cultivate a rich sense of self-worth, and to know that, like, when shit hits a fan or when things are difficult, that situation sucks, but I don't suck.
Yep.
It's allowing myself to be disappointed or sad or frustrated and not make that mean that I'm not enough. There's a great quote by Madonna, actually, that says, power is being told you are not loved and not being destroyed by it.
Oh,
And to
yeah.
me, I'm like, fuck, if that's not self-worth, I don't know what else is. Is it going to hurt? Absolutely. Is that going to suck if somebody doesn't love you? Absolutely. But it does not mean you're not lovable. It does
Mhm.
not mean you're not enough. And so to me, that definitely is the bright side of life, is believing and being anchored in your own enoughness.
That's beautiful. And that's one of the most unique definitions I've had
Oh,
for
cool.
that. So awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your insights and exercises. I greatly appreciate it. This was such a great conversation.
Oh, I appreciate it so much, Melissa. Thank you.
Yes.